and pray that your flight may not be in the winter or on the Sabbath. Is Jesus foretelling a future Sabbath observation? This is Preach the Word podcast. We study, we apply, we teach the Word. Welcome, beloved. In this episode, we are going to study the contextual, the cultural, the historical, and linguistic backgrounds of Matthew chapter number 24, verse number 15 and 20. Let's get started. In Matthew 24, verse number 15, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Verse number 20, and pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath. What was Jesus talking about here? Let's try to understand the context. Jesus in Matthew chapter number 24 is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. Primarily, he was with his disciple on Mount Olive. He had a conversation with them, trying to forewarn them about the coming destruction of Jerusalem. He was telling them that in the near future, Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. And what will happen will be so devastating. The entire city of Jerusalem will be destroyed. So I'm going to give you some signs. When you see them, flee to the mountains. Jesus had this discussion with his disciples on Mount Olive. The ultimate goal of Jesus for telling them these warnings was to ensure that they get to know in advance and prepare to flee when they see that. If you read the earlier verses in Matthew chapter 24, you will get exactly the story or the context in this wise. Now, during winters, river bodies get flooded. The weather conditions in winters can very cold, making traveling difficult. Also, on Sabbath days, city gates are usually closed to ensure that the Gentiles who are not observing Sabbath will not bring in trade-related issues. So to avoid any kind of disturbances and distractions, the city gates were usually closed to ensure a solemn observation of the Sabbath. Now we can find this very truth in the lives of the Israelites. Nehemiah chapter number 13 verses 19. The gates of Jerusalem were closed on the Sabbath day. In Exodus chapter 16 verses 29, Israelites were not to travel for a certain distance on Sabbath day. So on Sabbath days, traveling to longer distances above 1 mile was strictly prohibited. Also, in Acts chapter number 1 verse 12, Luke mentions Sabbath day's journey, showing distance limitations. Historically, Jesus' prophecy was fulfilled in the period of the Roman Empire. The prophecy that Jesus spoke about came to fulfillment in and around AD 70, when the Roman government besieged Jerusalem and destroy it utterly. Luke chapter number 21 verse 20 to 21 makes it clear, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. So clearly we see here Jesus, this is a para account to Matthew 24, warning them that when you see these signs, run away, flee to the mountains. Eusebius, who was a historian, a Christian historian, Eusebius says, the early Christians remembered Jesus Christ's warning and fled to Pella, modern day Jordan, before the city's destruction. When you read the church history, book 3, chapter 5, Eusebius says this. Now, why is it important to understand all these backgrounds? When Jesus said that, make sure or pray that this event does not happen during winter, and also pray that it doesn't occur on Sabbath day. He's trying to convey a message to the disciples that on Sabbath days, or on the day of Sabbath, remember, the city gates will be closed and fleeing will be very, very difficult for you. Also, you are limited. The devout Jews who still held onto the observation of the Sabbath despite the emergence of Christianity would not permit you to move out, beloved. So this is the reason for which Christ was saying, pray the destruction does not fall on the Sabbath day. He was not telling the disciples to ensure they observe the Sabbath during that period. However, the fact of the matter here and the content of discussion here is this: Christ knew that those Jews who had not yet responded to the call of Christianity would still continue to observe the Sabbath in the future. And remember, most of the Jews were still in the Sabbath observation. They were still in Judaism, despite the fact that in Acts chapter number 7 verse 6, some of the priests, the Jewish priests, the Levites, who understood the concept of new movement being Christianity and left Judaism, some were still in Judaism. I mean, most of them were still in Judaism. That is why Christ said that. So Christ did not mean that the Sabbath will be observed in the future by his disciples. Rather, he was warning them that yes, Sabbath will be observed by the devout Jews, those that I'm going to end my ties with. The nation of Israel, or the Israelites, were chosen to be God's own people. There came a time, as Jesus prophesies here, that I'm going to end everything with you. That called for this discussion we read in Matthew chapter number 24 and verse 20. So, all these background checks would help us to come to the conclusion that Christ warned the disciples of the destruction of Jerusalem to fall on either winter or Sabbath. Now, so there were two things here. Christ said winter or Sabbath. So one at a time. So those of you or those of us who probably interpret this text to mean Sabbath alone, Christ sided two things here, either on Sabbath or on winter. So does it mean that the disciples were commanded to observe winter if it is true for Sabbath observation? So the point is clear that during the time Sabbath observation was still ongoing, not by the disciples of Christ, not by Christians, but by the devout Jews who still held onto the observation of Sabbath. Therefore, Christ never meant that in the future his disciples will be observing the Sabbath. The context is clear. The historical background is clear. The cultural and the linguistic analysis are clear that there's no way to interpret this passage to mean Christ endorsing Sabbath to be observed by his disciple in the future. If this is helpful, please subscribe and leave a comment. Thank you for watching Preach the Word.